Commander Veltar stood at the observation deck of Kepler Station, watching the stars through the thick, transparent aluminum. His blue-scaled hands gripped the railing as he read the report for the 5th time. The words had not changed, but he kept hoping they would. The Nexus swarm had consumed another star system, 3 systems in 2 solar cycles, entire worlds stripped of all life, their biomass converted into more swarm ships and drones. Billions of beings dead or worse, absorbed into the collective consciousness that drove the swarm ever forward. The communication panel behind him chirped. Veltar turned to see Admiral Kresh's face appear on the screen. The old Rixon's tusks were yellowed with age, but his eyes still burned with the fire that had made him a legend among the warrior caste. "Commander Veltar," Kresh's voice rumbled through the speakers. "The Council has made their decision about the Defense Force." Veltar waited. He had learned long ago that patience was often rewarded with information that impatience would never receive. They have approved the inclusion of humans in the joint operation. The words hit Veltar like a plasma bolt to the chest. "Humans, sir? The species from the Outer Rim territories?" "The same." Kresh's expression was unreadable. "I know what you are thinking, Commander. I had the same doubts. But desperate times call for desperate measures. The swarm has never been stopped once it begins feeding. We need every advantage we can find." Veltar had heard of humans, of course. They were a relatively new species to the galactic community, having achieved faster-than-light travel only 50 standard years ago. Their technology was primitive by galactic standards. Their worlds were small and their population limited. They had no natural advantages that made them suitable for combat against something like the Nexus swarm. "Sir, with respect, what exactly do humans bring to this operation that the Rixon warriors or Zephyrian tactical systems cannot provide?" Kresh was quiet for a long moment. "That is what we are going to find out, Commander. The human contingent will arrive at your station within 2 rotations. You will integrate them into the Defense Force and prepare for departure to the Helios system." The screen went dark, leaving Veltar alone with his doubts. 2 rotations later, Veltar stood in the main docking bay as the human transport ship connected to the station. The vessel was smaller than he had expected, built with clean lines but lacking the elegant curves of Caltharian design or the intimidating bulk of Rixon warships. It looked functional, nothing more. The airlock cycled open and the humans emerged. Veltar had seen images of humans before, but seeing them in person was different. They were shorter than most galactic species, with soft skin that looked fragile, compared to his own scales or the chitinous plates of the Zephyrians. Their faces were expressive in a way that made Veltar uncomfortable, emotions playing across their features like water over stones. The human leading the group was a man who appeared to be in his middle years by their species standards. He wore a simple uniform with minimal decorations, and his dark hair was cut short and neat. When he approached Veltar, his movements were economical and precise. "Commander Veltar," the human said in accented but clear galactic standard. I'm Captain Li Dongwu of the Earth Defense Force. Thank you for hosting us." Veltar studied the human captain. Li was calm, almost unnaturally so. While other species representatives had arrived with fanfare and displays of strength, this human seemed more interested in observing than impressing. "Captain Li," Veltar replied, extending his hand in the human gesture of greeting he had studied. "Welcome to Kepler Station. I trust your journey was acceptable." "It was efficient," Li answered, shaking Veltar's hand with a firm grip. "May I introduce my second-in-command, Lieutenant Colonel Park Ji-min." The human female who stepped forward was even smaller than her captain, barely reaching Veltar's shoulder, but something in her posture suggested she was not as fragile as she appeared. Her eyes were dark and alert, constantly scanning the docking bay as if cataloging potential threats and advantages. "Commander?" Park said simply, offering her own hand. "Lieutenant Colonel," Veltar replied. "How many personnel have you brought?" 200 soldiers, support staff, and specialists," Li answered. "We travel light, but we are adaptable." As the rest of the human contingent disembarked, Veltar tried to hide his growing skepticism. The humans looked like any other species he had encountered, perhaps even more vulnerable than most. They carried a mix of weapons, some of which looked primitive by galactic standards. Several soldiers were equipped with what appeared to be projectile weapons alongside the standard energy rifles that every civilized military used. "Captain," Veltar said, "I must ask about your equipment. Some of your weapons appear to be quite old in design." Lee followed Veltar's gaze to where a young soldier was checking a rifle that fired metal projectiles. "Ah, you are referring to Private Kim Tae-ho's rifle. Yes, we still use kinetic weapons for certain situations. They have advantages that energy weapons do not. Such as? Reliability, primarily. They function in environments where energy weapons fail. Also, they are difficult to shield against using conventional defensive systems." Veltar nodded politely, though privately he wondered what environments these humans expected to encounter, where standard weapons would fail. The Nexus swarm was dangerous, but they were still biological entities. Energy weapons had proven effective against them in the past, even if the swarm adapted quickly. Over the next several cycles, Veltar worked to integrate the human forces with the other species that made up the Joint Defense Fleet. The Rixen warriors were impressive as always, towering beings whose natural armor and enhanced strength made them ideal for close combat. The Zephyrians brought their advanced tactical analysis systems and precision weapons that could target enemies from incredible distances. The humans seemed adequate in the training exercises, but nothing more. They followed orders well and worked efficiently with the other species, but Veltar saw nothing that justified their inclusion in such a critical mission. During one particularly challenging simulation, where the joint forces had to repel a swarm boarding action, the humans performed competently but not exceptionally. Private Kim Tae-ho, the young soldier with the projectile weapon, managed to hold his assigned position against simulated drones, but so did soldiers from every other species. After the exercise, Veltar found himself in the observation lounge with Captain Lee, watching the stars and discussing the upcoming mission. "Captain," Veltar said carefully, "I hope you will not take offense, but I must ask, what unique capabilities do your people bring to this operation?" The Nexus swarm has consumed 3 star systems. They have never been stopped once they begin, feeding on a world. Every species in this fleet was chosen for specific advantages against this threat. Lee was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the stars. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful. "Commander, every species believes they know what they are capable of until they are truly tested. The swarm has never encountered humans in combat. We have never encountered the swarm. This will be a learning experience for both sides. But surely your military analysts have developed strategies based on the available data about swarm tactics and capabilities." "They have," Lee agreed. "But humans have learned that no plan survives contact with the enemy. When the time comes, we will adapt." There was something in the way Lee said the word adapt that made Veltar's scales ripple slightly. It was not the confident boasting he had expected, nor was it the careful political language that most species used when discussing their military capabilities. It was something else entirely, something that he could not quite identify. The next morning, Admiral Kresh transmitted the final orders. The joint fleet would depart for the Helios system within 1 rotation. Intelligence reports indicated that the swarm had begun its assault on the mining colonies there. If they could not be stopped at Helios, 3 more systems would fall within the month. As Veltar watched the human soldiers preparing their equipment, he noticed something he had missed before. While other species checked their weapons and armor, with the methodical precision of professional soldiers, the humans seemed almost casual about their preparations. They joked with each other, laughed at stories Veltar could not understand, and generally behaved as if they were preparing for a routine training exercise rather than a battle that would determine the fate of billions. Only Captain Lee and Lieutenant Colonel Park seemed to share the gravity that the other species brought to their preparations. They moved through the human ranks, speaking quietly with their soldiers, checking equipment, and reviewing tactical data with the same calm focus they had shown since their arrival. Private Kim Tae-ho was cleaning his projectile weapon when Veltar approached him. The young human looked up and smiled in the disconcerting way his species did when acknowledging a superior. "Private," Veltar said. "Are you prepared for what we may encounter at Helios?" Kim's smile widened. "As prepared as anyone can be for something they have never seen before, sir. You do not seem concerned about facing the Nexus swarm." "Concern is useful for planning," Kim replied, returning to his weapon maintenance. "Fear is useful for fighting. Right now, I am just curious to see what—" The Helios system appeared on the main screen like a vision from a nightmare. What should have been 3 beautiful worlds orbiting a bright yellow star had become something that made Veltar's blood run cold in his veins. The planets were covered in dark, writhing biomass. From orbit, they looked like infected wounds against the black of space. Strange growths pulsed across their surfaces, and ship-sized creatures moved between towering organic structures that reached up toward the void. "By the ancestors," whispered Commander Thex, the Zephyrian tactical officer. "How long have they been feeding here?" Admiral Kresh's voice crackled through the communications system. "Intelligence reports indicate the swarm arrived 6 rotations ago. They have consumed approximately 60% of all biomass on the 3 inhabited worlds." Veltar felt his stomach turn. That meant billions of beings had been absorbed into the swarm's collective consciousness. Their bodies had been broken down and rebuilt into drones, ships, and the horrific organic infrastructure that now covered 3 worlds. "Fleet positions," Admiral Kresh commanded. "Begin standard engagement protocols." The joint fleet moved into formation. Rixan heavy cruisers took the front positions, their massive guns charging with enough energy to crack moons. Zephyrian precision ships formed a supporting line, their targeting systems already calculating firing solutions for maximum effectiveness. Caltharian vessels, including Veltar's own ship, activated their shield generators to protect the fleet's flanks. The human ships took positions that seemed almost random to Veltar. They were scattered throughout the formation rather than grouped together like the other species. When he asked Captain Lee about this over the communication channel, the human's response was simple. "We prefer to maintain flexibility in our positioning," Lee said. "It allows for rapid response to changing situations." The first wave of swarm ships emerged from the infected planets like antibodies responding to an infection. They were unlike any vessels in the galactic database. Instead of clean metal and precise engineering, these ships looked grown rather than built. Their hulls pulsed with organic rhythms, and strange appendages twitched along their sides. "All vessels engage at will," Admiral Kresh ordered. The battle began with the familiar light show of energy weapons crossing the darkness of space. Rixan plasma cannons sent streams of superheated matter toward the swarm ships. Zephyrian pulse lasers created precise cuts in enemy hulls. Caltharian ion beams disrupted the electrical systems that kept the organic ships functioning. For a moment, it seemed like the first engagement would go well. Several swarm vessels broke apart under the combined firepower of the joint fleet. But then Veltar noticed something disturbing. The destroyed ships were not simply falling apart. They were dissolving, their biomass flowing toward the remaining vessels and being absorbed. "They are adapting," reported Commander Thex. "Enemy hulls are developing resistance to our weapon frequencies." Veltar watched in horror as the swarm ships began to change before his eyes. Their organic hulls thickened where energy weapons had been most effective. New growths appeared that seemed designed to deflect or absorb different types of attacks. "Second wave incoming," called out the sensor operator. 50 vessels larger than the first group. This time, the swarm ships were ready. They had learned from the destruction of their predecessors. Energy weapons that had been devastatingly effective minutes before now barely scratched their modified hulls. The battle turned ugly fast. A Rixan cruiser took a direct hit from something that looked like a living torpedo. The organic weapon burrowed through the ship's armor and began consuming it from the inside. Within minutes, the proud vessel was nothing more than a floating mass of corrupted metal and flesh. "All ships fall back to secondary positions," Admiral Kresh commanded. "Reform the line." But the swarm was not content to let them retreat. Smaller vessels, no larger than fighters, swarmed toward the joint fleet. These were clearly designed for boarding actions. Veltar could see movement inside their transparent sections, swarm drones, ready to overwhelm any ship they managed to breach. Brace for boarding actions, Veltar announced throughout his ship. All security teams to battle stations. The first boarding pod hit Veltar's ship like a meteor. The impact sent vibrations through the hull, and emergency alarms began wailing throughout the vessel. More pods followed, each one boring through the ship's armor with acid and organic cutting tools. Veltar made his way to the security station, where his crew was preparing to repel the invasion. Caltharian soldiers checked their energy rifles and activated their personal shields. Everything was proceeding according to standard defensive protocols. The first breach came in Section 7, near the engine room. Veltar watched the security monitors as his soldiers took positions behind cover and prepared to engage the enemy. He had fought boarding actions before. The key was to establish overlapping fields of fire and prevent the enemy from gaining a foothold. But when the first swarm drone emerged from the breach, Veltar realized that nothing in his experience had prepared him for this. The creature was roughly humanoid in shape, but that was where any similarity to known life forms ended. Its skin was gray-black and appeared to be made of the same organic material as the swarm ships. Multiple arms ended in claws that could tear through metal. Its head was elongated with no visible eyes but a mouth full of teeth designed for ripping and tearing. The worst part was that it moved with intelligence. This was not some mindless beast. It was a thinking creature that had been absorbed into the swarm collective and repurposed for combat. Veltar's soldiers opened fire, their energy rifles sending bolts of coherent light toward the drone. The creature staggered under the assault but did not fall. Instead, its skin began to change, developing the same adaptive resistance that the swarm ships had shown. More drones poured through the breach. Within minutes, his soldiers were falling, back their weapons becoming less effective with each shot. The creatures learned from every attack, their bodies adapting to counter whatever was used against them. Section 7 is lost, reported his security chief. The creatures are moving toward the main corridors. Veltar felt true fear for the first time in his military career. These things could not be stopped with conventional weapons. They adapted too quickly, learned too fast, and there were hundreds of them aboard his ship. All available personnel converge on Section 8, he ordered. We make our stand there. As he made his way through the corridors of his own ship, now feeling like a stranger in a hostile environment, Veltar began to understand why the Nexus swarm had never been stopped. They did not just fight. They consumed. They learned. They adapted. And they were winning. The lights flickered as the swarm drones damaged critical systems. Emergency power kicked in, bathing everything in an ominous red glow. Veltar could hear the sounds of combat echoing through the ship's corridors. Energy weapons firing, metal being torn apart, and worst of all, the screams of his crew being overwhelmed by creatures that felt no pain and feared no death. When he reached Section 8, he found his remaining soldiers in a desperate firefight with a group of drones that had somehow flanked their position. The creatures moved with coordinated intelligence using tactics that suggested they were sharing information instantly across the collective consciousness. "Commander," called out Lieutenant Zex, his communications officer. "We are receiving a transmission from the human vessel Determination." "Put it through," Veltar ordered, hoping against hope that someone had found a way to fight these things. Captain Lee's calm voice came through the speakers, though Veltar could hear the sounds of combat in the background. "Commander Veltar, what is your status?" "We are being overwhelmed," Veltar replied honestly. "The swarm drones are adapting to our weapons faster than we can adjust our tactics. How are your people faring?" There was a pause before Lee responded. When he did, there was something new in his voice, something that Veltar had not heard before. "We are learning about our enemy," Lee said, "and they are learning about us. This is going to be very educational." The transmission ended, leaving Veltar with more questions than answers. Around him, his crew continued their desperate fight against an enemy that seemed impossible to defeat. But somewhere in the darkness of space, the humans were having their own encounter with the swarm. Soon, Veltar would discover that education could be a very dangerous thing, especially when the students were willing to learn lessons that other species would find too terrible to contemplate. The sounds of combat grew closer, and Veltar prepared to make his last stand against creatures that represented everything he had been taught to fear about the dark spaces between stars. But he was beginning to suspect that the real horror was not the enemy they were fighting. It was what his human allies might become in order to fight them. The joint fleet limped away from Helios Prime to regroup at a safe distance. Veltar stood in his damaged command center, watching repair crews work to fix the holes that swarm drones had torn in his ship's hull. They had managed to drive off, the boarding party, but at a terrible cost. 30% of his crew was dead or missing, and his ship would need major repairs before it could fight again. The casualty reports from other vessels were equally grim. The Rixen heavy cruiser warrior's pride had been completely lost, consumed from within by swarm organisms. 2 Zephyrian precision ships had suffered critical damage and were barely operational. Only the human vessels seemed to have escaped with minimal losses. How is that possible? Veltar asked Captain Lee during the fleet commander's meeting aboard Admiral Kresh's flagship. Your ships took the same beating we did, but your casualty reports show less than 5% losses. Lee sat quietly at the conference table, his uniform showing scorch marks and what looked like acid burns, but his expression remained as calm as ever. We used different tactics during the boarding actions, he said simply. What kind of tactics? Admiral Kresh demanded. The old Rixen looked tired and angry. Losing one of his heavy cruisers had hit him hard. Effective ones, Lee replied. The swarm drones adapt to energy weapons quickly, but they have weaknesses. That can be exploited through other means. Commander Thex, whose ship had barely survived its own boarding action, leaned forward. What other means? We tried everything in our tactical database. Lee glanced at Lieutenant Colonel Park, who nodded slightly. Something passed between the two humans that Veltar did not understand. With respect, Commander Thex, your tactical database is based on fighting opponents who think and react like galactic species. The swarm collective consciousness operates differently. They share information instantly, but they also share vulnerabilities. Explain, Admiral Kresh ordered. Lee activated a portable display unit and showed recordings from the human ship's boarding actions. Veltar watched in fascination as human soldiers engaged swarm drones in close combat. But instead of using energy, weapons like every other civilized species, the humans were employing primitive projectile weapons and something even more disturbing. Bladed weapons, knives, swords, and axes that looked like they belonged in a museum of ancient warfare. You fought them with hand weapons? Veltar could not keep the disbelief out of his voice. Among other things, Park spoke for the first time during the meeting. The swarm drones adapt to energy patterns very quickly, but they have trouble adapting to physical trauma applied in specific ways. The recording showed a young human soldier, Private Kim Taeho, cornering a swarm drone in a narrow corridor. Instead of shooting it, he drew a long blade and attacked the creature with surgical precision. Each cut was placed to cause maximum damage to what appeared to be nerve centers along the drone's modified body. The creature tried to adapt, its skin changing to become more resistant, but Kim's attacks were not random. He was systematically disabling the drone's ability to function, cutting tendons, severing neural connections, and causing damage that could not be easily repaired. Most disturbing of all, Kim was smiling while he did it. Your soldier appears to be enjoying himself, Commander Thex observed with obvious distaste. Private Kim takes pride in his work, Lee said matter-of-factly. As do all our soldiers when they are properly motivated. Admiral Kresh studied the recordings with growing unease. Captain Lee, these tactics are unusual. The galactic conventions of warfare prohibit unnecessary cruelty to enemy combatants. The swarm drones were once sentient beings who were forcibly absorbed into a collective consciousness, Park replied coolly. They are already experiencing the ultimate cruelty. We are simply providing them with a faster path to termination. There was something in the way she said termination that made Veltar's scales ripple with discomfort. It was not the clinical language of military efficiency. It was something else, something that sounded almost eager. The meeting continued with discussions of ship repairs and tactical adjustments. But Veltar found his attention drifting back to the human recordings. The more he watched, the more disturbed he became. The humans were not just fighting the swarm drones, they were hunting them. After the meeting ended, Veltar made his way to the human section of Admiral Kresh's flagship. He wanted to understand better what he had witnessed. The corridor leading to the human quarters was quieter than the rest of the ship. Human voices carried differently than other species, and their conversations seemed more subdued. He found Captain Lee in what the humans called a briefing room, reviewing tactical data with several of his officers. When Veltar entered, the conversation stopped immediately. "Commander Veltar," Lee stood and offered the human greeting gesture. "How can we assist you?" "I wanted to discuss your boarding action tactics in more detail," Veltar said. "Some of the methods your people employed were unfamiliar to me." "Please sit," Lee gestured to a chair. "I understand that our approach may seem unusual from a galactic perspective." "It is not just unusual," Veltar said carefully. "It is concerning. Your soldiers seem to be causing unnecessary suffering to the enemy." Major Yoon Hanul, whom Veltar recognized from the personnel files as a psychological warfare specialist, spoke up. "Commander, may I ask how many boarding actions you have repelled in your military career?" 17, Veltar replied, wondering where this was leading. "And in those actions, how many enemy combatants did you capture for intelligence purposes?" Veltar thought for a moment. "None. Standard procedure is to eliminate all hostile boarders to prevent contamination of ship systems." "So you killed them all," Yoon said simply. "That is different," Veltar protested. "We eliminated threats to our ship and crew in the most efficient manner possible. And we eliminated threats to our ship and crew in the most effective manner possible," Lee interjected. "The difference is that we study our enemies before we kill them." Lieutenant Colonel Park activated another recording. This one showed a human soldier named Sergeant Choi Bin-ho engaged with a swarm drone in what looked like hand-to-hand combat. But as Veltar watched, he realized that Choi was not just fighting the creature, he was experimenting on it. Each strike was designed to test a different aspect of the drone's capabilities. How fast could it adapt to different types of damage? Which areas of its body were most vulnerable? How did it communicate with other drones when injured? The drone was clearly in agony, its modified body writhing as Choi systematically explored its weaknesses, but the human's face showed no emotion except clinical interest. "This is torture," Veltar said quietly. "This is research," Park corrected. "Every piece of information we gather makes the next encounter more efficient. That drone's suffering contributed to saving the lives of everyone on our ship. But surely there are more humane ways to gather intelligence." "Are there?" Yoon asked. "Commander, you said you have fought 17 boarding actions. In how many of those did you learn something new about your enemy that made future battles easier?" Veltar did not answer, because the answer was none. Galactic military doctrine focused on stopping threats as quickly as possible, not understanding them. "The swarm collective consciousness is the greatest threat our galaxy has ever faced," Lee said quietly. "It has consumed entire star systems, because previous defenders were too civilized to fight it effectively. We will not make that mistake." "What mistake?" Veltar asked. "The mistake of believing that there are rules in a war for survival," Park replied. "The swarm does not follow galactic conventions. It does not show mercy to civilians. It does not take prisoners. It consumes everything it touches and converts it into more weapons to use against us." Lee stood and walked to the viewport, staring out at the damaged ships of the Joint Fleet. "Commander Veltar, every species in this galaxy became civilized by learning to limit their capacity for violence. But sometimes, civilization becomes a weakness rather than a strength. You are saying that humans have not learned those limits?" "We are saying that humans learned those limits and then we learned when to ignore them," Yoon said with a slight smile that made Veltar uncomfortable. The conversation continued for another hour, with the humans explaining their tactical philosophy in ways that both fascinated and horrified Veltar. They spoke of warfare not as a necessary evil to be ended as quickly as possible, but as a complex problem to be solved through the application of controlled violence. They had terms for concepts that other species had never needed to name. Psychological warfare meant breaking an enemy's will to fight through fear and intimidation. Force multiplication meant using minimal resources to achieve maximum psychological impact. Escalation dominance meant being willing to go further than the enemy in the application of violence. Most disturbing of all, they spoke of these concepts with the same calm professionalism that other species used when discussing engineering. Problems or logistics challenges. As Veltar left the human section and returned to his own damaged ship, he found himself thinking about Private Kim's smile during the boarding action recording. It had not been the expression of someone who enjoyed causing pain. It had been the expression of someone who was very good at a job that needed. The intelligence gathered from the swarm drones had revealed something that changed everything. Deep beneath the organic growths covering Helios Prime, there were spawning chambers where new drones were being created from the absorbed biomass of billions of consumed beings. If these chambers could be destroyed, the swarm's ability to replace losses would be severely damaged. The problem was getting to them. The spawning chambers are located 3 kilometers beneath the planet's surface, Captain Lee explained to the assembled strike team leaders. The tunnels leading down are filled with acidic atmosphere, extreme heat, and the largest, most aggressive drones the swarm has produced. Veltar studied the intelligence data on his tablet. The environmental readings were horrifying. The tunnels reached temperatures that would kill most galactic species within minutes. The acidic atmosphere would eat through standard environmental suits in less than an hour. And the drones guarding the chambers were 3 times larger than anything they had encountered in space. "This is a suicide mission," stated Commander Thex bluntly. "No rational military force would attempt such an assault." "Which is exactly why it might succeed," Lee replied calmly. "The swarm collective consciousness makes tactical decisions based on analyzing probable actions by rational opponents. If we act irrationally, we gain the advantage of surprise." "Admiral." Kresh looked around the briefing room at the assembled officers. "Captain Lee, even if a strike team could reach the spawning chambers, how would they destroy them? The organic infrastructure is designed to regenerate from damage." Lee glanced at Lieutenant Colonel Park, who activated a holographic display showing a detailed schematic of the swarm's breeding facility. "The chambers are controlled by queen organisms," Park explained. "These are the original consciousness, patterns of the first beings absorbed by the swarm on each world. They maintain the mental coordination needed to manage the spawning process. If the queens are eliminated in the correct sequence, the entire facility will collapse." "How do you know this?" Veltar asked. "We extracted the information from captured drones during our previous engagements," Major Yoon replied. "Human interrogation techniques are quite effective, even on collective consciousness entities." Veltar felt his scales ripple with discomfort. He did not want to know what interrogation techniques the humans had used on creatures that were already suffering the torment of forced absorption into the swarm. "Who will lead this strike team?" Admiral Kresh asked. "I will," Lee said without hesitation. "Along with a volunteer force of human soldiers, we specialize in operating in hostile environments that other species would find impossible to survive. Captain, I cannot ask you to sacrifice your people for this mission." "You are not asking," Park interjected. "We are volunteering. This is the type of operation human forces are designed for." Over the next 2 cycles, Veltar watched the humans prepare for their descent into what could only be described as hell itself. They modified their equipment in ways that seemed almost ritualistic. Weapons were coated with substances that would cause maximum pain to organic targets. Environmental suits were stripped down to bare minimum protection to allow for greater mobility. Most disturbing of all, the human soldiers seemed genuinely excited about the mission. "Commander Veltar," Private Kim approached him in the equipment bay. "Captain Lee said you wanted to observe our final preparations." Veltar nodded, though he was beginning to regret his curiosity about human military methods. "I am trying to understand how your people maintain morale before such a dangerous operation." Kim smiled. and Veltar was once again struck by how unsettling human facial expressions could be. We do not think of it as dangerous, sir. We think of it as challenging. Humans perform best when we are pushed beyond what we think we can survive. That seems like an unusual psychological response. Maybe, Kim admitted, but it works for us. Would you like to see my kit? Before Veltar could respond, Kim had laid out his equipment on a nearby table. Along with the standard gear that any soldier might carry, there were items that looked like they belonged in a torture chamber rather than a military arsenal. This is a sonic disruptor, Kim explained, picking up a device that looked like a modified energy weapon. It does not kill targets quickly. Instead, it causes intense pain by disrupting their nervous system. Very effective for crowd control. Crowd control? When you are outnumbered by enemies, sometimes the best strategy is to make them afraid to approach you. Pain is a universal language, sir. Kim continued his equipment tour, showing Veltar weapons and tools that seemed designed more to terrorize than to kill efficiently. When he reached a collection of bladed weapons, his enthusiasm became almost infectious. These are for close work, he said, picking up what looked like an ancient combat knife. Energy weapons are efficient, but they do not send the right message to observers. When other enemies see their companions being taken apart with hand weapons, it affects their willingness to continue fighting. You are talking about psychological warfare. Everything is psychological warfare, sir. The only question is whether you are willing to admit it. Later that cycle, Veltar found himself in the unusual position of volunteering for the strike mission. He could not explain why, even to himself. Perhaps it was professional curiosity about human tactical methods. Perhaps it was a sense of duty, to witness whatever his allies were about to attempt. Perhaps it was because he was beginning to understand that the humans represented something new in galactic warfare, and he wanted to see it with his own eyes before it changed the galaxy forever. Commander, Captain Lee said when Veltar submitted his request, I appreciate your willingness to participate, but this mission requires capabilities that most species do not possess. What capabilities? The ability to function effectively while experiencing levels of fear and pain that would incapacitate rational minds, Lee replied simply. Humans have learned to use fear as a tool rather than allowing it to control us. I want to understand how. Lee studied Veltar for a long moment. Very well, but understand that witnessing human combat operations at close range can be educational in ways that are difficult to forget. The strike team consisted of 12 humans and Veltar. They launched from the human vessel Determination in a modified transport that had been heavily armored and equipped with acid-resistant hull plating. As they descended toward Helios Prime's corrupted surface, Veltar got his first close look at what the swarm had done to the planet. The organic growth covering the world was not random. It was a planned transformation, converting an entire ecosystem into a factory for producing more swarm creatures. Rivers had been diverted to feed nutrient flows into massive organic processors. Mountains had been hollowed out and converted into breeding chambers. Cities had been consumed and rebuilt as nerve centers for coordinating the planet-wide conversion process. Billions of intelligent beings had been reduced to raw materials for an expanding war machine. Landing zone ahead, announced Corporal Nam, Subin, the team's navigator. Entrance to the tunnel system is clear, but sensor readings show heavy movement below ground. They touched down near what had once been a major city. Now it was a pulsing mass of organic architecture that stretched for kilometers in every direction. The tunnel entrance was a circular opening that seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting with a rhythm that suggested it was part of a living system. Environmental suits sealed, Lee commanded. Remember, we are not just fighting for our own survival down there. We are fighting for the survival of every species in the galaxy. As they entered the tunnel system, Veltar immediately understood why this mission required volunteers. The walls were covered with a substance that looked like diseased flesh, and they pulsed with veins that carried unknown fluids through the organic infrastructure. The air was thick with chemical vapors that made his environmental suit's filters work overtime. But the worst part was the sounds. Echoing through the tunnels came noises that could only be described as screams. Not the mechanical sounds of industrial processes, but the tortured voices of conscious beings, trapped within the swarm's collective consciousness. The absorbed minds maintain individual awareness during the conversion process, Major Yoon explained, when she noticed Veltar's reaction. It makes them more effective as information sources for the collective. You mean they are still conscious while being turned into drones? For several cycles, yes. The swarm finds that terror improves the quality of the mental patterns they absorb. Veltar had thought he understood the horror of the Nexus swarm. He had been wrong. As they descended deeper into the tunnel system, they encountered the first guards. These were not the standard drones they had fought in space. These creatures were massive, with thick armor plating and claws designed for close combat in narrow spaces. They moved with the coordinated intelligence of the collective consciousness. But they also seemed to enjoy the violence they inflicted. Veltar watched in fascination and horror as the human soldiers engaged these monsters in combat that was more like a dance of mutual destruction. Instead of trying to kill the creatures quickly, the humans seemed intent on making the fight last as long as possible. Sergeant Choi Bin-ho cornered one of the massive drones, and the mission to destroy the spawning chambers had succeeded beyond all expectations. As the strike team's transport ship climbed away from the dying planet below, Veltar found himself staring at Captain Lee with new eyes. The human sat calmly, in his seat, cleaning his weapons with the same methodical precision he brought to everything else. But there was something different about him now, something that made Veltar's scales ripple with unease. "Captain," Veltar said quietly. "What exactly did we accomplish down there?" Lee looked up from his weapon maintenance. "We eliminated the primary spawning facility for this sector of the swarm. It will take them several cycles to rebuild their production capacity." "That is not what I meant." Lee studied Veltar for a moment, then set aside his weapon. "What do you think we accomplished, Commander?" Veltar considered his words carefully. "I think we did something that will change how the galaxy understands warfare. What I saw in those chambers was not just military action. It was something else entirely." "It was education," Lee replied simply. "We taught the swarm collective consciousness something it had never learned before." "Which was?" "Fear." The word hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Veltar had suspected this, but hearing it confirmed made him realize that he had witnessed something unprecedented in galactic history. "The intelligence reports from other engagements are already coming in," Lieutenant Colonel Park said from across the transport cabin. "Swarm forces are exhibiting new behavioral patterns. They are retreating from battles they could win. They are abandoning systems with minimal resistance." "How is that possible?" Veltar asked. "The collective consciousness does not experience individual emotions like fear." "It does now," Major Yoon replied with what Veltar was beginning to recognize as a distinctly human expression of satisfaction. "We have been conducting a systematic program of psychological conditioning across multiple engagements. Each encounter was designed to teach the swarm specific lessons about what happens when they fight humans." Veltar felt a chill that had nothing to do with the transport's climate controls. "You mean this was planned from the beginning?" "Not specifically," Lee said. "But human military doctrine has always emphasized the importance of psychological warfare alongside conventional tactics. When we realized that the swarm shared experiences across their collective consciousness, we recognized an opportunity." "What kind of opportunity?" Park activated a portable display showing tactical analyses from recent human engagements with swarm forces. "The collective consciousness is designed to share information instantly across the entire network. This includes sensory data, tactical assessments, and yes, pain responses. So when you caused suffering to captured drones, every other drone in the network experienced it as well. More than that," Yoon added, "we have been training them to associate specific stimuli with specific outcomes. Human voices, human weapon signatures, even human ship configurations now trigger fear responses throughout the swarm network." Veltar studied the data on the display with growing unease. The humans had not just been fighting the swarm. They had been conducting a galaxy-wide experiment in behavioral conditioning, using an entire species as test subjects. "Captain Lee," he said slowly, "what you are describing sounds like something beyond normal military operations. This is psychological manipulation on a scale that affects an entire civilization." "Yes," Lee agreed without any trace of discomfort. "It is exactly that." The transport docked with the human vessel Determination an hour later. As they transferred back to the main ship, Veltar noticed that the human crew treated the returning strike team with a mixture of respect and something else that he could not quite identify. It was not fear exactly, but it was definitely unease. Even the humans were disturbed by what their special operations forces were capable of. "Commander Veltar." Private Kim approached him in the corridor outside the briefing room. "Captain, Lee said you wanted to understand more about human military capabilities. I'm beginning to think I understand too much already." Kim smiled, but it was not the same enthusiastic expression Veltar remembered from their first meeting. There was something harder about it now, something that spoke of experiences that had changed the young soldier in fundamental ways. "Sir, what we did down there was necessary, but it was also just the beginning." "The beginning of what?" "Of showing the galaxy what humans can do when we decide that something needs to be stopped." Kim led Veltar to a secure section of the ship that he had not seen before. The corridors here were different, more heavily armored and with security systems that seemed designed to keep people in as much as to keep intruders out. "This is where we keep the real intelligence data," Kim explained, as they entered a room filled with displays and analysis equipment. "The information that we do not share with the other species." The screens showed tactical assessments that made Veltar's breathing quicken with anxiety. Human forces had been conducting operations throughout the galaxy that went far beyond the official joint missions. Small teams of specialists had been infiltrating swarm-controlled systems, gathering intelligence, and conducting what the reports termed psychological preparation operations. "You have been fighting a secret war," Veltar said. "We have been preparing the battlefield," Kim corrected. "Everything you saw in the spawning chambers was the culmination of months of careful conditioning. We have been teaching the swarm to fear us one encounter at a time." The data showed engagement after engagement where human forces had deliberately chosen methods that would cause maximum psychological impact rather than maximum tactical effectiveness. Battles that could have been won quickly were prolonged to allow for what the reports called educational demonstrations. Captured enemies were subjected to interrogation techniques that seemed designed more to traumatize the collective consciousness than to gather information. "This is monstrous," Veltar said quietly. "This is effective," Kim replied. "Sir, the swarm has consumed 3 star systems and billions of lives. They were an unstoppable force because no one had ever shown them what it felt like to be prey instead of predator. And now you have. Now we have." Veltar spent the next several hours reviewing the intelligence files with a growing sense of horror and fascination. The humans had developed a comprehensive understanding of swarm psychology that went far beyond anything other species had achieved. They knew how the collective consciousness processed information, how it made tactical decisions, and most importantly, how it could be manipulated. But the files also revealed something else that disturbed Veltar even more than the scope of human psychological warfare capabilities. They showed that the methods being used against the swarm were adapted from techniques that humans had originally developed for use against each other. "Captain Lee," Veltar found the human commander in his private quarters, reviewing reports from other human operations across the galaxy. "I need to ask you something, and I need an honest answer." "Go ahead, Commander. The techniques your people used against the swarm, where did they come from?" Lee was quiet for a long moment. "From human history, Commander. We spent thousands of years fighting wars against opponents who were just as intelligent and adaptable as we were. We learned to win those wars by breaking our enemies psychologically before we broke them physically. You used these methods against your own species." "We perfected these methods against our own species," Lee corrected. "What you have seen us do to the swarm is actually a restrained application of capabilities we developed for conflicts where the opponents understood our psychology, as well as we understood theirs. That is terrifying. Yes, Lee agreed. It is. So why are you telling me this? Lee stood and walked to the viewport, staring out at the stars. Because when we return to the fleet, the other species are going to ask questions about our methods. They are going to want to establish guidelines and limitations on human military operations. They need to understand what they would be limiting. And what would they be limiting? The most effective anti-swarm capabilities in the galaxy, Lee said simply. Commander, what we did in those spawning chambers will be transmitted to every swarm facility in known space. Every drone, every ship, every collective consciousness node will now carry the knowledge that humans exist and what we do to our enemies. That sounds like a strategic advantage. It is. But it also means that the swarm will never be able to coexist peacefully with humanity. We have made ourselves into something they will always fear, which means they will always see us as existential enemies. Veltar felt the implications of that statement settle over him like a heavy blanket. You have created a permanent state of war. We have created a permanent state of swarm retreat, Lee corrected. There is a difference, but the long-term consequences may be the same. The conversation was interrupted by an emergency communication from Admiral Kresh. The Joint Fleet was receiving reports from across the galaxy of swarm forces abandoning systems they had been in the process of consuming. Entire battle groups were retreating toward the galactic rim without explanation. It is working, Lee said as he read the reports. The psychological conditioning is spreading through their network faster than we anticipated. Is that good? 6 months after the Helios system operation, Admiral Veltar stood in the same observation deck where his journey with the humans had begun. But everything had changed. The stars looked the same, but the galaxy they illuminated was fundamentally different. The reports on his desk told a story that would have been impossible to believe before he met Captain Lee and his soldiers. The Nexus Swarm, the unstoppable force that had consumed entire star systems for 2 solar cycles, was in full retreat. They had abandoned 12 conquered systems and withdrawn toward the galactic rim, fleeing from something that terrified them. More than the prospect of starvation, they were fleeing from humans. Admiral, his aide Lieutenant Kex announced, the Galactic Council session is ready to begin. Captain Lee has arrived as requested. Veltar nodded and made his way to the council chamber. His promotion had come with the successful defense of the Helios system, but he sometimes wondered if it was a reward or a punishment. His new position required him to serve as the primary liaison between human forces and the rest of the galactic military. It was not an easy job. The council chamber was filled with representatives from dozens of species, all of them struggling with the same impossible question that had dominated galactic politics for the past 6 months. How do you maintain an alliance with beings who have proven themselves indispensable, but whose methods challenge every principle of civilized society? Captain, Lee entered the chamber with the same calm demeanor he had always shown, but Veltar noticed changes in him as well. The human captain now wore insignia indicating his promotion to the position of human military liaison, and his uniform bore decorations from species across the galaxy. But there was something else different about him. Something in his eyes that had not been there before. Lee had seen what his people were truly capable of, and he was no longer entirely comfortable with it. Captain Lee, Admiral Kresh called the session to order. The Council has reviewed the tactical reports from 17 separate engagements with swarm forces over the past 6 months. In every case, human forces achieved complete victory with minimal casualties. However, we continue to receive disturbing reports about the methods employed. What specifically concerns the Council? Lee asked politely. Commander Thex activated a holographic display showing footage from the most recent engagement. This recording shows human soldiers conducting what can only be described as psychological torture on captured swarm drones. The creatures were kept alive for several rotations while being systematically dismembered for the purpose of terrorizing other enemy forces. The technique achieved complete surrender of a swarm battle group without further loss of life on either side, Lee pointed out. Previous engagements against similar forces typically resulted in total destruction of all combatants. That is not the point, protested Representative Yuldor of the Centaurian Commonwealth. The point is that your methods represent a fundamental departure from accepted standards of warfare. We are concerned about the precedent this sets. Buer studied the assembled representatives for a moment before responding. Respectfully, representatives, your accepted standards of warfare were developed for conflicts between civilized opponents who share common values and limitations. The Nexus Swarm does not share those values. They view mercy as weakness and restraint as opportunity. So you believe that fighting monsters requires becoming monsters? Admiral Kresh asked bluntly. I believe that fighting monsters requires understanding what monsters fear, Lee replied, and what they fear is not death. What they fear is encountering something more monstrous than themselves. The debate that followed was one that Veltar had witnessed many times over the past months. The non-human species wanted to maintain their alliance with humanity, while somehow limiting human military methods to approaches that did not disturb their sense of galactic civilization. The humans, for their part, were willing to accept guidelines and limitations. But they made it clear that such restrictions would reduce their effectiveness, and they would not be responsible for the consequences. Captain Lee, Veltar said when the formal debate had ended, may I ask a personal question? Of course, Admiral. When you first arrived at Kepler Station, did you know that your mission would require the methods your forces ultimately employed? Lee was quiet for a long moment. Admiral, every human military officer studies the history of warfare on our homeworld. We know that conflicts against existential threats require solutions that peaceful societies prefer not to contemplate. We hoped that the swarm could be defeated through conventional means, but we were prepared for the alternative. And now that you have employed those alternatives, how do you view your own actions? As necessary, Lee said simply. But that does not make them pleasant or easy to live with. It was the first time Veltar had heard a human express any doubt about their military methods, and it gave him a new perspective on the beings he had come to fear and respect in equal measure. After the council session ended, Veltar found himself walking through the station's civilian areas. The corridors were filled with refugees from the former swarm-occupied systems, beings who had been rescued from conversion centers and spawning facilities by human strike teams. Many of them bore the physical and psychological scars of their ordeal. But they were alive. Without human intervention, they would have been absorbed into the collective consciousness and transformed into weapons against their own species. Admiral Veltar, a young Caltharian female, approached him. She had been rescued from a conversion facility on Rigel 7, and her scales still bore the marks where swarm organisms had begun the absorption process. Yes, citizen. Is it true that the Council is considering restrictions on human military operations? She asked. The Council is discussing guidelines for future operations, Veltar replied carefully. With respect, Admiral, I do not care about guidelines. I care about results. The humans saved my life and the lives of thousands of others. If the Council restricts their methods, how many beings will die because they were too civilized to save them? It was a question that Veltar had been asking himself for months. How do you balance the moral discomfort of witnessing necessary brutality against the moral responsibility of protecting innocent lives? That evening, Veltar received a private communication from Captain Lee requesting a meeting. They met in Veltar's quarters, away from the formal protocols of military briefings and council sessions. Admiral, Lee said without preamble, I need to share something with you that was not included in the official reports. Veltar gestured for him to continue. The psychological techniques we used against the swarm were more effective than we anticipated. Our analysis indicates that the fear responses we programmed into their collective consciousness have spread beyond the drones we directly encountered. What do you mean? Lee activated a portable display showing intelligence data from across the galaxy. Swarm forces are now exhibiting fear responses when they encounter any human presence, even in situations where no actual threat exists. Our psychological conditioning has become a permanent part of their collective memory. That sounds like a positive development. In the short term, yes, but Admiral, we have essentially created a species-wide phobia. The swarm collective consciousness now views humans as existential predators. This means they will never be able to coexist peacefully with us, even if they abandon their expansion. Veltar felt a chill run through his body as he grasped the implications. You have created a permanent enemy. We have created a permanently terrified enemy, Lee corrected. There is a difference, but it may not be a meaningful one from a strategic perspective. Why are you telling me this? Because the Galactic Council needs to understand what humans are before they decide how to integrate us into their society. We are not just another species with different tactics. We are something that can fundamentally alter the psychological makeup of our enemies. Lee paused, staring out the viewport at the stars. Admiral, humans spent our entire evolutionary history as persistence predators. We did not evolve to be the strongest or fastest hunters. We evolved to be the most terrifying. We learned to break our prey psychologically before we broke them physically. And now you have applied those same techniques to interspecies warfare. Yes, and the results will shape the galaxy for centuries to come. The conversation continued late into the night, with Lee explaining aspects of human psychology and military doctrine that had not been included in any official reports. Veltar learned that the soldiers he had fought alongside were not representative of typical human military forces. They were specialists, selected and trained for operations that required capabilities most humans found disturbing. But they were still human. And their methods were still derived from fundamental aspects of human nature that existed, to some degree, in every member of their species. 3 cycles later, the Galactic Council reached its decision. The vote was close, but the practical reality of the swarm threat overcame the moral concerns about human methods. Humanity was granted full membership in the Galactic Defense Alliance, with the official designation of Special Operations Command. They would be responsible for missions that other species could not or would not undertake. Winner,